you again for having me on again to talk about another book, Until Morning Comes. It's another vigilante thriller. I'm Jonathan Epps, and
Explain how you prepared to write a book of this caliber that tackles the global crisis of human sex trafficking.
it's an issue that's ubiquitous and has been for ever since Epstein came into the headlines. It's obviously pilfered from that story. There are major plot points that I extracted directly from that true crime nonfiction story into this novel, and then I invent the fiction around that. The only two people who are based on real life characters is the villain Jeffrey Hoffman. Obviously, again, it's on the nose. I make no bones about it. You're supposed to see the obvious parallel. And I call her Maxime Breadwell in the novel, and that's Ghislaine Maxwell. So those are the two people in it. Those are the only two people in it who are real figures from the real story. Everything else was based on things that I had read about it and fictional invention. I was not particularly interested in the Epstein story. I was kind of in one ear and out the other, like, elite people doing dastardly things yet again, kind of a thing. And then I read this one article from a New Hampshire journal that was after the fact. And it was a journalist, and I don't even remember the names, tiny publication. And this journalist wrote a story about how they once Maxime's house, because she had a hideaway mansion up there. Again, that's another parallel. And this journalist tracked it down and went to the property, and there was an Englishman on the estate property. And this is real. This comes from a real article. And he approached her with a, quote, aristocratic sounding accent, which I also used in the novel. Some of the dialogue from that article I pilfered and used in the novel. And then she said, "Oh, where are you from? What part of England are you from?" And he said, "Nowhere. I'm from here. Thank you. No photographs, please. Have a nice day," and shoot them away. And I thought, as soon as I read that, literally, I've never had this experience before. The entire novel came to my head. It just like flooded into my mind, and I saw the entire thing, beginning, rising action, climax, ending. I just saw the whole thing, and obviously without the details. And because that was just so bizarre to me, that an Englishman who had a posh sounding accent, and if you've been to England, most people don't have that accent. For him to be in the United States, be on that property, sound like an aristocrat, and then deny that he was from England. No aristocratic sounding Englishman would deny from being from England and would ever say that they were from the United States. So it was just so bizarre to me, and that's what got me interested in writing this novel. Obviously, it's a contentious issue. It's a difficult issue. It's a criminal issue. Minors are involved. We still don't know the full details of the whole thing. But when you read parallel stories of this nature all the time that don't involve rich men, that involve every layer of society. And I decided that I had to have a female protagonist who was a teenager and very poor, living in a trailer park in Florida, who was seduced by this woman, Maxime, not sexually, but just sort of maternally and sort of quasi-romantically in that way, like asexual, like a romance, because she drives up in this Mercedes, and Ava Rose is jogging on the side of the highway, and she just seduces her with her car and her talk and her interest in her. And this girl is not used to that sort of attention, especially from a rich person, and she was snagged. She's brought back to the mansion, she's delivered to Jeffrey, and it goes from there. And then flash forward 10 years, and obviously, she has escaped. She becomes alcoholic. The trauma that she denied at the time for the fun, the excitement, the luxury, the glamour, has come back to haunt her. She realizes, well, not so much at first, but she slowly realizes just what she had done to herself and to other girls, because she had become a recruiter for them. By the time she's 18, she does her last gig at the island and sees something horrific and escapes. She's in her middle 20s, totally alcoholic, loses her job, loses her relationship, loses everything, is at rock bottom, and decides to go after these men and this woman in particular.
Go into detail about Caleb and Ava's relationship.
I mean, they meet each other at that counseling camp for abused children, teenagers, and that's where they fall in love and they decide to try to build their lives back together again. And so when she becomes sort of deranged by alcohol and the traumas of the past, and yet repressing and denying it at the same time, he's kind of worked through his stuff and knows she has kind of said, almost like in total denial. When at first she just accepted it and said, at the treatment camp, she's very sort of blunt about it. At this point, she's sort of denying it and it's destroying her life, and he can't take it anymore. And then she is vicious in one of their fights and lashes out at him with respect to that. And that almost breaks him because he'd done so much work to get over it that he couldn't have the one person he loved use it as a weapon against him. Look, it's an issue that has a huge range of victims from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, male, female, you name it. And I wanted to evidence that in the entire text and yet keep Ava's story the central focus. So there are moments when you see glimpses of this issue, sometimes in bits and pieces, sometimes in a character like Caleb, where you can see this issue has a dynamism and a monstrosity to it that is hard to fathom, hard to understand, hard to accept. But I felt duty bound to acknowledge it in as many of its various forms.
I felt connected to Ava while reading this book.
Good. You're supposed to identify with her primarily. Yeah, you're supposed to identify with her torment and her struggle. And everyone has been traumatized in some way by something, somehow. I mean, life engenders suffering. That is the most well-known thing about life. If there's anything we know about it, it's that it is a process of suffering. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or middle of the road. Everyone suffers, and sometimes people with what looks like tremendous luxury and comfort are suffering the most. I mean, a lot of people with no work, all the privileges in the world, are deeply, deeply depressive folks because they have no sense of, because suffering and struggle are sort of in tandem. And if you struggle through suffering, you can have victories. You can have mini victories, you can have big victories. And that's part of what makes life worth living, is having those victories. If you never have to struggle for a victory, it's a pretty monotonous life, and you may live in a palace, but it just looks like your house. You don't appreciate it. And so that's an element to Ava that everyone can relate to. She is a white girl, but she's from a trailer park, and she is poor, but she's had these privileged experiences. And the men in the real story and in the novel, these are incredibly powerful, well-known, very rich men. And so it's not like she's being dragged around by Johns under a bridge. She's being lavished. She's being lavished with gifts and compliments and flirtations and possibly and money and even opportunities. I mean, Piper gets to go up to New York and then does the London circuit, and this was an international jet set experience that could absolutely blind them from the damage they were doing to themselves and to each other.
This is not just an elite issue.
It's kind of a phantom thing. And it is insane that it happens. It happens inside of families. I mean, that's why it's unrecognizable in a family walking by where it's happening, because it's a mother, father, and their children, and who knows what kind of abuse is going on at home because closed away from the rest of the world. And it's not anyone's place to go barging into their house to see what's going on. Um, and I'm sure a lot of it happens under the cover of darkness in the middle of the night. Um, I read a horrific story about a girl at the border that just was absolutely monstrously repulsive. This little 8-year-old girl. I don't know if it's true, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. And you hear a lot of stories like that at the border where these people are completely destitute and desperate and willing to pay, all the money, everything they have in the world, they're giving to these coyotes who are very dangerous men. And they're ushering them to what they think is a free and better life. And, that's a completely whole set of issues unto itself. But it is a deeply human and deeply potentially pathological set of circumstances. And the fact that, something like 60 men had abused this little girl based on samples, found inside of her. The fact that not one of those men thought to protect her and instead used her and discarded her is pretty horrific stuff. And it's hard, like I said, it's hard to fathom. It's hard to wrap your mind around the actual reality of it.
How did you go about your research?
So I did enough research to understand trauma, that kind of sexual trauma, how it can manifest itself, how it can be repressed, and then come out in other ways. I did enough to have a grasp of it, but a lot of it is, I think, just intuition, observing other people. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, from everyone from Oprah to Phil Donahue had victims of sexual abuse on. I've seen a lot of those, all of America has seen shows about this sort of thing. So this is in our consciousness, So yeah, this issue is as old as time. The Greeks, the Romans, we're rich and powerful people have been abusing young, poor and desperate people for millennia. I think this is partly why there's a lot of sort of fatigue with this story and disinterest at this point, because who doesn't know someone who's been sexually abused or had issues in this way? And not to be flippant about it, I don't mean to sound like that, but it is sort of odd that people are not more determined to resolve this as a crisis, because it seems like now more than ever it's a major crisis. And cultures deal with these things differently. Cultures are more permissive about these things than others. And so there's just kind of a miasma of confusion around how to proceed. And I think all of the people who have been unnamed, who are name redacted, sort of benefited from that hesitancy, that confusion and that hesitancy and that fear, actually.
What was the underlying theme you were trying to convey?
Because I wanted this to be a female-driven story. I wanted the female protagonist, I wanted a female detective, and I wanted a female villain. Not because, but the irony is most of the villains surrounding this issue are men. But I wanted them to kind of be hovering over, almost like demonic shadows over these women's lives, imposing figures who have dictated not only the way they behave, but the way they interact with one another. And Valdivia represents the one who has broken free. She still sort of has to deal with it, but she's the most free of it. Whereas Ava is trying to get free of it and become independent. That's why I love that ending scene when she's walking down the road, because she finally realizes she's free. And Maxime obviously is never free. So there were like gradations of female liberation in a way. And it's not a feminist novel, and it's not intended to be pedantic and theoretical. But there is that sociological element there, and that was intentional. I wanted this to be a vigilante thriller for women, played by women. Now, I'm a man, I'm a gay man, and I've been watching and observing women my entire life, all kinds of women with all different kinds of personalities and characters. And so I used what I knew from them to give these three characters as much life and as much realness as I possibly could.
When developing Ava and Piper, was it important to humanize their experience rather than villainize the role they played in that system?
Yes. I had to make them. This is why I have Ava, when she's recruiting the 15 and 16-year-olds for that last weekend, she rejects the 14-year-old. I mean, it's not a huge ethical move on her part, but at least there's something there that knows what they're doing is not right, even though she's still playing the selfish, narcissistic game of fulfilling this role. I could not make them villains, you know. I mean, Piper isn't one of the heroes, but she is one of the catalysts of Ava's heroism. And because she looks up to Ava as a hero before Ava ever becomes a hero, because Ava from the beginning has a strong will. But it's just unguided, it's fractured. And I couldn't. I mean, this is why. But in the scenes where she's fighting with Caleb, there's some villainy there. Ava is not a perfect angel. You know, she's vicious to him, in the worst inhumane way. Piper is a lesbian and finds a partner, and she finds stability and peace in that situation, and sort of breaks away. But then she's the one who sort of, she helps Ava when Ava sort of has a mental break and breaks free from the destabilizing elements in her life that are a result of not dealing with the trauma. Piper is the one who helps facilitate the first steps in her revenge.
You seem to go there with these real life topics.
I mean, I'm kind of a provocateur. I pick issues that people don't want to face, and I find them compelling, because if you don't face it, then the story's never told. And if I'm a storyteller, if I'm a competent storyteller, then I should do my job and tell stories that have a lot of complexity, a lot of interest, a lot of maybe benefit, but also a lot of rejection. You know, these are rejected stories. No one wants to deal with mass shooting, sex trafficking, and this dystopia I'm working on sort of deals with the general cultural collapse, social pathologies that we're seeing all over, across the spectrum. That who knows where this is going, and this dystopia sort of posits that it's going towards full collapse, and then what happens when everything collapses. And people don't really want to address that either. I mean, people are addressing that issue now more than ever, I'll say. But mass shootings and sex trafficking are particularly taboo in a lot of people's minds because they involve people underage. They involve teenagers. They involve young children at times. And no one shall last forever. I didn't have any explicit gore. No, you don't read about anyone being shot up and ripped to pieces, because that is inappropriate. That is grotesque. That is not my job. But it is my job to sort of investigate something that people are afraid to confront. And it's the proverb of holding, I don't know if it's a proverb, but it's a sort of axiom about art, is holding up the mirror to the face of the culture. Thank you again for having me on again to talk about another book, Until Morning Comes. It's another vigilante thriller. I'm Jonathan Epps, and glad to talk to you.